Hey everybody, Chris Serino here from Sultana Education Foundation's virtual classroom. Today we're going to be talking about the very first voyage of expedition made by Captain John Smith. This happened in the summer of 1608. Right behind me I have this incredible map that Smith published in 1612. Well, how did he get that information? How did he know where all these rivers went? The way he knew that was he went on a series of 2 voyages in a little boat called a shallop, which we believe was about 25 feet long, powered by 1 or 2 sails, but mostly also powered by oars. To give you an example of what one of these oars would have looked like, I actually have a reproduction of it right here. So imagine being under manpower and covering almost 2,000 miles in the course of 1 summer. That's what Smith actually accomplished to pull off this feat and make this incredible map. Now, if you zoom in on the map, at the head of the bay, we have a depiction what we believe to be Smith's shallop, or a vessel much like it, right here. So what we're going to do next is show you what that vessel would have looked like in its actual size, and then we'll show you the route took on Voyage 1, starting on June 2nd, 1608.
So I'm now sitting in a digital projection of a shallop. This is about the size of the boat, and as you can see, it's not a very large vessel. So imagine 14 men crammed into this boat. They'd be sitting on these benches in front of me and rowing those oars. If they had any wind, they'd take advantage of it. So next to me, there would have been a mast coming up holding the sails. And as they left Jamestown, they left behind the only people they knew. They were heading out into unknown territory. No maps existed, and they barely spoke any of the language of the people who lived there. So it was a dangerous journey, to say the least. Smith and his men set out from Jamestown on June 2nd in 1608. And the line right now is tracing his route on his first voyage. So we're going to watch the places that he went, and then once this finishes playing out, I'll talk about some of the highlights. Anytime you see a dot appear, that's a spot where he had some sort of significant encounter. Keep in mind, they could only carry about 3 days worth of supplies, so you'll notice that white line is regularly making visits ashore to trade. So let's look at where he actually went. He started out coming out of the mouth of the James River and was immediately blown almost out to the ocean, and they kind of caught onto the eastern shore here and bounced their way up the eastern shore, stopping along the way to trade, going in and out of some of these rivers. Smith recalls in his journal that he had a tough time finding reliable drinking water on the eastern shore, with it being so flat and the water being heavily brackish. Also keep in mind that they were looking for a potential northwest passage, so it made more sense to spend their time exploring the western shore. So he pretty quickly cuts across to the western shore. They're making their way up by the Patapsco River and Baltimore, and they find that this area is very devoid of people, which was a problem for them because they needed to trade for fresh supplies. When they're not finding anyone to trade with, Smith's men start to almost mutiny, and he realizes it's time to head back south towards Jamestown. So they make their way back south when they pass by the Potomac River, which is 10 miles wide at its mouth and heads in a northwest direction. So this excited them that that was a potential trade route. They journey up the Potomac River past Washington, D.C., and they reach a point called Great Falls, Virginia. There was a waterfall. It was obvious that this river was not going to lead them to another ocean. So they turn back around, make their way back down the Potomac, and as they're heading back towards Jamestown, there's a point where there's a low tide, and the shallop gets stuck in a sandbar, and to pass the time, waiting for the tide to lift their boat again, they see a lot of fish and rays swimming in the shallows. And they didn't have fishing rods, but they had their swords, so they're trying to spear fish. And Smith actually is able to spear one of these rays, and the ray whips its tail back and catches him in the arm. Smith's arm begins to swell up and turn colors, and he tells his men in dramatic fashion to dig his grave right there on the beach. They did have a doctor on board the vessel, and the doctor begins to mix every medicine he has in his bag and creates this ointment which he smears on Smith's wound. And whether it was the ointment or if Smith was going to get better on his own, he begins to recover. He realizes he's not going to die, and he tells his men that they're eating ray for dinner. And actually on his map, he labeled that Stingray Point a name which carries over to today. Smith and his men make it back to Jamestown after that near-death experience to conclude the end of his first voyage along the Chesapeake Bay. But as you look at where they went and where they didn't go, there were quite a few places he missed, entire rivers on the western shore. He never made it to the northernmost point of the bay. So Smith knew, even though he was back in Jamestown and had seen quite a large chunk of this estuary, his map was incomplete and his exploration still needed a second voyage.
All right, so to wrap up, to make his incredible 1612 map of the bay, John Smith took 2 voyages. On his first voyage, which we just showed you, he explored the lower Delmarva Peninsula, came up here and explored the Pocomoke and Nanticoke rivers, sailed all the way up north to what we today call the Patapsco River, which he called the Bolus Flu. At this point, the men were running out of food and supplies. They turned back and then made about a month-long exploration of the Potomac River, came back. Smith got stung by a stingray right here and then returned to Jamestown. He rested for 3 days and then went out on a second voyage to map the rivers he hadn't covered on Voyage 1, and we'll show you that in a separate video. That's all for today's lesson. Thank you for joining us on Sultana Education Foundation's Virtual Classroom.